Callum Ferris thought he was just a dock worker, until he discovered containers were carrying more than goods, they were carrying Europe's cocaine trade. Behind the scenes, Elias, Rook and Maura Veyne ran a criminal empire of logistics, corruption and secrecy, where one mistake could bring the entire operation crashing down. Liverpool's docks had long been a symbol of industry and trade, a place where cranes towered like metallic giants over ships that carried goods to every corner of the globe. To the casual observer, the docks were just another busy port, a hub of commerce, with workers loading and unloading crates day and night. But beneath this surface of legitimate trade, a hidden world had begun to take shape, a world that few dared to speak of. Containers, the steel boxes that seemed so ordinary, had become conduits for something far darker. They carried not only merchandise but also the seeds of crime that would ripple across Europe. Elias Rook was the man who first saw the opportunity. Once a logistics consultant with an impeccable track record in supply chain management, he had grown bored of the monotonous world of spreadsheets and shipping schedules. What drew him in was the thrill of the forbidden, the chance to manipulate a system built on trust. Rook's vision was audacious. He realized that shipping containers, moving constantly across continents, could be used to transport illicit cargo with near impunity. But he wasn't a criminal mastermind in the traditional sense. He was a thinker, a strategist, who understood patterns and weaknesses in logistics the way others saw traffic lights. To make his plan work, Rook began forming relationships with dock workers, who were either desperate, disillusioned, or simply eager to make extra cash. Among them was a man named Callum Ferris, quiet and unassuming, who knew the docks like the back of his hand. Rook recruited Ferris and others, training them to subtly manipulate container seals, falsify paperwork, and switch manifests without drawing attention. What began as small experiments soon grew into a carefully orchestrated system, capable of moving containers without detection, a system that turned Liverpool's bustling port into a shadow corridor for crime. The Redscale Syndicate, a local mafia-style organization, had been eyeing the docks for years, led by Maura Veyne, a woman whose reputation for intelligence and ruthlessness rivaled that of any European crime boss. The syndicate saw an opportunity in Rook's operation. Veyne had a vision of expanding her influence, of taking control not just of local crime, but of the transnational flow of high-value drugs. She recognized that control of the port meant control of the gateway to Europe's lucrative cocaine market. Meanwhile, far beyond Liverpool, a cartel known only as La Sombra Blanca was quietly plotting its next shipment. Based in Spain, the cartel had established a network that spanned the Atlantic and beyond, moving cocaine in massive quantities with surgical precision. They had tried Liverpool before, sending small test shipments to gauge how easily cargo could pass undetected. The success of those early shipments had not gone unnoticed. When Rook's network intersected with the cartel's operations, the potential for profit and danger skyrocketed. The two groups were connected by opportunity, greed and a shared understanding of risk. Rook quickly realized that success depended on discretion. Even the smallest mistake could bring the entire operation crashing down. He implemented a system of rotation, constantly moving containers in unpredictable patterns, so no single shipment would draw attention. Dock workers were instructed to audice, memorize and adapt. Loyalty was rewarded, suspicion punished. Within months, Liverpool's containers carried not just bananas, electronics and textiles, but cocaine worth millions of pounds. The docks, once merely a symbol of trade, had become a shadow marketplace, invisible to the public but alive with danger and ambition. The thrill of the operation came with its own psychological toll. Rook found himself constantly calculating risk, imagining scenarios in which every container, every worker, every official could betray him. Maura Veyne's eyes were always on the bigger picture, always scanning for threats, both from within her organization and from the far-reaching tentacles of La Sombra Blanca. Even the dock itself seemed alive, a labyrinthine environment where any wrong move could mean exposure. The containers, silent and steel-bound, were both shield and trap, hiding the illicit cargo while creating pressure that could explode at any moment. By the end of Rook's first year, the operation was humming like a well-oiled machine, but the underlying tension never left. Every crane lift, every truck loaded, every shipping document signed carried the weight of consequence. Liverpool, a city with a proud history of trade and innovation, had become an unassuming gateway to Europe's underworld. And while few knew what was happening, the docks were changing, quietly but irrevocably. Elias, Rook and Maura Veyne had turned ordinary shipping containers into instruments of crime, and as they watched their empire grow, one thing became painfully clear. In this shadowed world, the price of ambition was always measured in risk, and the cost of failure could be deadly. The Redscale Syndicate had learned quickly that moving cocaine through Liverpool's docks was more than just hiding it in a container. It was a science, an art that required patience, precision, and an understanding of human and mechanical systems alike. Containers were no longer just metal boxes, they were laboratories, puzzles, and sometimes weapons. Elias, Rook and Maura Veyne realized that simple concealment would not be enough. Authorities were becoming sharper, and scanners and tracking systems had grown more sophisticated. What they needed was innovation. To achieve this, they enlisted Nikolai Draven, a man with a reputation that carried whispers of both brilliance and danger. Draven had been a security consultant for cargo shipments across Europe, but his career ended abruptly after allegations of theft and falsifying inspection records. Some said he had fled to Liverpool seeking anonymity. Others believed he was drawn by the challenge of creating something untraceable. Whatever the reason, Draven quickly became the architect of Redscale's smuggling techniques. He treated containers like three-dimensional chessboards, finding ways to hide cocaine in false bottoms, between layers of produce, and inside seemingly mundane items like furniture or machinery. Every shipment was meticulously mapped, every weight and seal calculated to avoid detection. Draven also taught the syndicate to exploit weaknesses in customs procedures. Small oversights, like predictable inspection schedules, unmonitored scanning devices, or reliance on digital manifests, could be turned into openings. Containers could be rotated through different docks, shuffled among trucks, and even exchanged at secondary ports to confuse trackers. Each operation was rehearsed repeatedly, with workers memorizing routes, timing, and the exact positions of containers on ships and trucks. Rook oversaw this network, ensuring that discipline and secrecy were absolute. Every worker knew that a single careless move could compromise not just a shipment, but the entire organization. The ingenuity of Redscale's operations became apparent when one shipment, supposedly carrying bananas from South America, was loaded with a hidden compartment filled with cocaine. Even the scanning machines in Rotterdam failed to detect it. The container passed through multiple checkpoints, each stop seemingly routine, yet each moment was part of a carefully orchestrated dance. The cocaine was then transferred to smaller vehicles for final distribution across Europe. It was a demonstration of logistics mastery and criminal audacity combined. But as the syndicate grew more confident, cracks began to appear. A container labeled as medical supplies became the first real test of their system. Something went wrong during its rotation through Antwerp. For a brief moment, authorities detected irregularities in the manifest. While the actual cocaine had already been moved, the anomaly set off alarms, sparking an investigation that rattled the dockworkers. The event was a wake-up call. Even the best-laid plans were vulnerable to scrutiny, mistakes, and human error. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on the people involved was becoming evident. Callum Ferris, the quiet dockworker who had been recruited by Rook, found himself constantly anxious, memorizing container positions and fearing the sudden arrival of authorities. Others were less cautious, drawn into the thrill and the easy money, unaware of the long-term consequences. Even Draven, for all his brilliance, seemed haunted at times, as if he could sense that the perfect system he had built was fragile and could collapse without warning. Maura Veyne, for her part, remained calm, calculating, always scanning for potential threats, both from inside her organization and from the far-reaching influence of La Sombra Blanca. The syndicate also had to navigate the relationship with La Sombra Blanca carefully. The cartel was impatient and exacting, expecting precision and loyalty. Every successful shipment strengthened Redscale's credibility, but one misstep could provoke violent retaliation. Rook and Veyne understood that their success depended not only on logistics, but also on diplomacy, deception and an understanding of human psychology. They cultivated trust while keeping their own strategies hidden, a delicate balancing act where one wrong signal could ignite conflict. By the end of this phase, Liverpool's docks had transformed into a nexus of high-stakes crime. Containers moved not as cargo but as carriers of clandestine power, linking local operations with transnational cartels. Every shipment carried the weight of potential profit, exposure and danger. The syndicate's methods were ingenious yet perilous, a constant reminder that the line between mastery and catastrophe was razor-thin. With every successful operation their confidence grew, but so did the invisible threat that loomed over them. One miscalculation could unravel everything, and as Draven often warned, even the most meticulous plan could be undone by a single human error. In the shadows of the docks, containers waited silently, heavy with secrets and consequences. Each one was a story of cunning, risk, and ambition. As Rook, Veyne, and Draven watched their system evolve, they knew that their network was more than a criminal operation. It was a complex, living machine. But with every success came a reminder that the game they were playing was deadly, and the next twist, the next mistake could come from anywhere. The more successful the Redscale Syndicate became, the more visible their shadow grew. Liverpool's docks, once merely a backdrop for global trade, had evolved into a theater of crime where every container, every manifest, and every worker carried weighty consequences. Their operations had become sophisticated, almost proud of its maritime heritage, had become a conduit for Europe's cocaine trade, and every container that left its docks carried both goods and the invisible weight of organized crime. By the end of this period, the syndicate had achieved a fragile equilibrium. Success and risk existed side by side, balanced on a knife's edge. Every shipment represented both a triumph and a potential catastrophe. Ferris continued to document the operations, a silent witness to a world built on secrecy and corruption. Celine Cortis remained a shadowed power, guiding and manipulating the system with subtle precision. And above all, Maura, Veyne, and Elias Rook maintained their grip on the network, aware that the next mistake, no matter how small, could unravel everything they had built. Liverpool's docks had become a paradox, a place of commerce and a stage for crime, a hub of prosperity and a portal to danger. Every container moving through the port carried more than goods. It carried ambition, secrecy, and the heavy, invisible weight of consequences that could change lives across Europe. The hidden web of corruption and cunning had reached a point where it could no longer be ignored, and those within it realized that the game they were playing demanded constant vigilance. One misstep, one act of betrayal could tip the balance, and when it did, no one would be safe. The first real cracks in the Redscale Syndicate's empire began to show when La Sombra Blanca started expressing impatience. For years, Liverpool had functioned as a quiet, efficient gateway for the cartel's cocaine shipments, but recent anomalies, misrouted containers, unexpected inspections, and the near detection of a medical equipment shipment had raised red flags. The cartel's patience had limits, and they demanded tighter control, more secrecy, and absolute reliability. The pressure shifted from the docks in Liverpool to the very heart of the syndicate itself. Maura Veyne, whose reputation for intelligence and ruthlessness had kept the organization in line, now faced internal challenges. Some of her lieutenants whispered doubts, arguing that the risk of exposure had grown too high. A few suggested scaling back operations or rerouting shipments through safer ports, while others questioned the loyalty of long-time dock workers. Veyne recognized that maintaining authority required more than strategy, it required psychological precision. She began implementing a system of oversight within the syndicate itself, monitoring behaviors, communication patterns, and even subtle changes in attitude. Paranoia, she knew, could be both protective and destructive. Elias Rook proposed an ambitious solution to reduce risk: rotate containers through multiple European ports before reaching their final destination. The idea was elegant, using misdirection and complexity to evade detection. Containers would be loaded in Liverpool, moved to Antwerp, then to Marseille, and finally to Spain, often changing trucks and trucks drivers along the way. On paper, it reduced the risk of pattern recognition. In practice, it introduced countless new variables, each with the potential to expose the operation. The experiment began with a shipment of electronics, carefully modified with hidden compartments designed by Nikolai Draven. The container moved smoothly from Liverpool to Antwerp, and for the first time, the syndicate allowed a small sense of confidence to creep into their operations. But the confidence was premature. In Antwerp, surveillance cameras captured irregular activity around the container, and investigators noticed anomalies in the manifest. It wasn't enough to seize the cargo yet, but it was enough to trigger an internal alarm within the European law enforcement network. The syndicate realized too late that their elaborate rotations had created new vulnerabilities, each port acting as a potential point of exposure. The aftermath sent shockwaves through Liverpool. Celine Cortis, the port insider who had long shielded the operations, vanished without a trace. Some claimed she fled to protect herself. Others whispered that she had been eliminated to prevent her from becoming a liability. Callum Ferris, already uneasy about the syndicate's operations, received subtle threats and warnings. Even Draven, whose designs had kept the containers undetectable for years, began expressing doubt, acknowledging that no system could withstand scrutiny indefinitely. The once tightly controlled network now felt precarious, as though the slightest misstep could trigger a domino effect of disaster. The syndicate scrambled to maintain control. Rook disappeared into hiding, moving between safe houses in Liverpool and surrounding regions, coordinating operations remotely. Veyne reinforced loyalty among remaining members, but internal trust had eroded. The lieutenants who had doubted her began to challenge her decisions openly, leading to subtle power struggles and secret alliances. Every shipment became a test of precision, every movement a calculated risk. The docks that had once been predictable and controllable now seemed hostile, as if the shadows themselves were conspiring against them. For the first time, the operation's fragility was impossible to ignore. Containers that had once passed unnoticed now required meticulous planning, constant oversight, and an ever-present awareness of law enforcement patterns. The syndicate's network was under siege, not by force, but by the invisible pressure of scrutiny, fear, and suspicion. Even successes came with consequences. Every shipment that arrived safely reminded them of how close exposure had been, how thin the line between empire and collapse truly was. By the end of this period, Liverpool's docks had become a landscape of tension. Every crane lift, every truck departure, every scan of a container carried potential danger. The syndicate's operation was no longer a smooth-running machine, but a precarious balancing act, teetering on the edge of collapse. The ambitious rotations, the hidden compartments, and the complex logistics that had once ensured success now amplified risk. The syndicate had learned, in the most brutal way, that innovation in crime carried a hidden cost. Each improvement increased exposure alongside efficiency. The ultimate lesson was clear. Redscale's empire had expanded rapidly, but ambition and ingenuity alone could not safeguard them against the intertwined threats of human error, law enforcement scrutiny, and cartel demands. Liverpool, once a quiet and unsuspecting hub, had become a theater of high-stakes tension, where every decision could spark disaster. The syndicate had survived this phase, but only just, and the shadows of collapse were growing longer with each passing day. The next twist would not wait, and when it came, it would change everything. The collapse of the Redscale Syndicate's carefully constructed network began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but once it started, there was no stopping the cascade. What had once been a precision operation had turned fragile and volatile. The near miss in Antwerp, combined with Celine Cortis's disappearance, had set off a chain reaction of paranoia, mistrust and mistake. Dock workers whispered in corners, lieutenants questioned authority, and Rook's constant absence left gaps in coordination. The containers, once symbols of power and secrecy, now felt like ticking time bombs. La Sombra Blanca, the distant but ever-present authority of the cartel, grew restless. The Liverpool operation had been their gateway to Europe, but with increasing scrutiny from customs and police networks, they began sending enforcers to oversee shipments personally. The presence of the cartel in Europe injected a new layer of tension. Any mistake, any delay could be punished with violence. The syndicate's members realized that their autonomy was gone. They were no longer masters of their own empire. They were caretakers of fragile conduits, each one scrutinized by invisible eyes. Rook, who had once thrived on control and calculation, found himself battling anxiety in ways he had never experienced. He moved constantly, reviewing shipping logs from safe houses, trying to anticipate where authorities might focus next. The sophistication of the containers no longer guaranteed safety. Even Draven's designs, once foolproof, could be exposed under sufficient investigation. One container, labeled as machinery parts, was intercepted in Marseille. The cocaine had already been removed, but authorities discovered irregularities in the manifests. It was a warning, a signal that the operation was unraveling, and the sense of invincibility that had guided Redscale for years evaporated. Maura Veyne responded with a mixture of ruthlessness and desperation. She tightened security within the syndicate, removing anyone whose loyalty was uncertain, and reorganized shipments to reduce predictability. However, this only fueled suspicion and fear. Lieutenants who had once deferred to her authority began plotting their own survival, some secretly cooperating with authorities in exchange for leniency. The very system that had made Redscale powerful, trust, secrecy, and loyalty, was now crumbling under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Callum Ferris, the dockworker who had quietly documented the operations for months, saw the moment of vulnerability as an opportunity. What had begun as personal unease had grown into a deliberate effort to gather evidence, to create a record of the syndicate's crimes that could not be ignored. He passed his files to investigators, providing a level of detail that no outsider could have uncovered. Every hidden compartment, every falsified manifest, every rotation of containers was laid bare. What had been invisible for years suddenly became tangible, actionable, and devastating.